I just say I've
Oh,
got
real
a
life.
cold,
Oh.
so
Oh, no. Yeah.
yes,
I can't hear it at all. Oh my God. I
good.
hope you feel better. I'm so
Thank you.
sorry.
No, I'm gonna try and mute myself if I end up in a coughing fit.
Oh my God. I totally I'm so sorry. And then I
It's the
hope you feel
season, I
better
think,
soon.
right now. Yes,
It is the flu season. I feel like the COVID is making a comeback for some reason.
it is.
Um, well, Kate, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I feel like you have one of the most like interesting job because as a podcaster, I feel like I like interview so many executives and I feel like each time is like I feel like a therapy session for myself just to like learn from people. And I feel like you have such an interesting job because you kind of do the opposite to train different executives. So maybe to give the audience a little bit of your background. So you're currently the VP of Executive Development at Meta. And prior to that, you have started your own company and you have been a partner at a different group. Maybe we could talk about like what were some early career lessons that you've learned early on in your career kind of shape you into who you are today.
Yeah, you bet. One maybe counterintuitive lesson, my very first job, I was miserable in. And while I would never wish that on anyone, it really required, I was in my early 20s, and on paper, it was a great job. And I was grateful to have it at the time because it was post the dot-com bubble burst. And so I felt I should be happy. I felt I should be grateful. And yet I really didn't enjoy it. And so it required me to do a lot of soul searching when I was really young about like, what do I really care about? What kind of work brings me to life? And I followed the work at the time of Kazik Mahai, who has done a lot of work on flow,
Mhm.
really mapping like what are those times where you lose yourself in an activity because it's this perfect balance of matching with your interests and challenge. And so I went through those types of exercises. I took myself through those when I was in my early 20s
Mhm.
and did that soul searching. And I think it set me on a really powerful path to like follow
Mhm.
at a young age what I cared the most about. So I was glad to learn that lesson early on. And I felt grateful, which sounds ironic that I didn't have a great first job or even a
Mhm.
mediocre first job, but like a truly that what felt like a miserable one for me. And then the second thing I deeply believe that is held really true is it's so important in this world to just follow your passions. People
Mhm.
follow leaders who are passionate. And like occasionally I'll get people who call up and they'll be like, how do I, become a VP at a Fortune 100 company or whatever? And I'll say, well, maybe don't make that the goal.
Mhm.
Maybe make the goal doing something that you deeply love and trust that kind of like the success can follow from that. So
Mhm.
following your passions and figuring out kind of what puts you in the flow state, I think are two of the most important sort of core lessons I learned at a young age.
For sure. I think like when I was like listening to your other podcasts about like ikigai, so I actually took like a training. It's not like a training, it's kind of more like an internet training. So I bought a course on like how people using ikigai to like find the things that you're like passionate about, what make you money and things you're good at.
And what
And
the
I
world
wonder,
needs. Yeah.
yeah, I feel like that's like a very I like that frame. I really like the framework. And I wonder when you're like chatting with the executives since like they're more towards like early like later on in their career. So like do people feel like do you think like the most successful executive they already find their ikigai very early on or do you feel like people could just still like um have like find that later on?
Yeah. So, for anybody who's not familiar with the concept of ikigai, it's this beautiful model coming from Japan. That's one of the countries I've lived in. So, I'm definitely influenced by a lot of thinking that comes from Japan. But
Mhm.
yes, it's these like four Venn diagrams of
Mhm.
what you're good at, what you can get paid for, what you enjoy doing, and what the world needs. And when you hit on all four
Mhm.
of those, you're in just this beautiful sort of bringing together convergence. So, I would say ikigai is somewhat of a fluid and somewhat of a stable thing, right? Like
Mhm.
the things that give you energy for me have been pretty stable state. So I think that one's whole. What the world needs, my goodness, is that changing right now?
Mhm.
What you're good at also can evolve a lot. And like what you can get paid for is also
Mhm.
shifting. So I view it as almost like a continual calibration that we want to be doing to think through and to consider different opportunities that might come our way. Like to what degree might it feed all four of those?
Mhm.
But like, at least where I work at Meta, even if I'm doing the same job, and I have been for quite a while at Meta, like it changes a lot.
Mhm.
And so really thinking about how to construct my reality to fit into the ikigai principles is an ongoing art. And I would say the same for leaders. It's like sometimes it's reawakening, sometimes it's recalibrating what you're doing to better fit with ikigai, which is a lot of the work.
For sure. Let me just quickly shut out my window because I feel like the construction people are coming.
Yeah.
So sorry. It normally never happened, but like I don't know why today it's people decided to construct their home next to us. But anyway, so I wonder, I guess like speaking of your work at Meta, so like maybe we could start with like what does your day-to-day look like? And then how do you kind of like create like a program for executive development?
Yes. My day to day, to your point, I'm glad my job seems interesting. It certainly is to me. That's how I know I'm hitting on my
Mhm.
personal ikigai. But I have the unique privilege. My day to day can vary significantly. I might be dropping in to support a team live and help them look at their dynamics, how they're communicating, how they're collaborating. I might be doing one on one coaching. I might be stepping back and working on the strategy of like, what is the development that our leaders are going to need over time. I might be doing some design work to try and bridge the two. How do I take what I know are needs of our leader and bring it to life? So my days are quite
Mhm.
dynamic and different. And that's, I think, part of what feeds me is every day is different,
Mhm.
with some constant sort of pillars of activity. But
Mhm.
I sometimes have the delight of opening up my calendar and being like, well, let's see what today's going to bring.
Mhm.
And it varies. To your question of how we design executive development programs. I
Mhm.
am fortunate that the leaders that I work with have a huge appetite to learn. And in my experience, historically, sometimes you're working on the will for people to work on themselves. And what had been my sort of real delight when I started working with what was Facebook at the time was the learning agility, the learning appetite, and the readiness to learn that our executives have.
Mhm.
So I'd been accustomed to maybe designing programs where you bring
Mhm.
a case study to create safety and have some parallels. And our leaders would walk in and they're like, cool, I've got time to work on myself. I want to work on X, Y, and Z. And we just get to drop in and do really effective work.
Mhm.
So that means I design here with a lot more of what I would call a container design concept. So I'm trying to create the right conditions that enable the fastest and deepest learning for our leaders, but it's less teaching, training. It's more facilitating the conditions, dropping in the right frameworks, tools, et cetera, that can help accelerate. But it's a pretty fun way to design and a pretty fun way to craft executive development programs for sure.
For sure. I wonder maybe if you could give us an example of like, let's say if let's say since a lot of our listeners are like founders and um VCs. So I guess like when maybe like they I guess like they're dealing with a different set of problem that as like, meta executives or meta C levels. Maybe we could like start with like let's say if I'm a leader at Meta, like how should I like start working together with you? Or like is there a training program for everyone? Would it be like kind of like group coaching session or would it be more towards like for each executive they have their own like development goals and then like you help them set up their own kind of like learning program? Would it be more towards like the soft skill side of things or like would it be more towards like AI or like people are I'm sure people are like developing themselves like in terms of like
Sure.
knowledge as well. What does that kind of like look like at Meta?
Yeah, we have a full suite of offerings, including technical training on AI to leadership development skills.
Mhm.
So it's really going to vary, and to maybe part of what you were highlighting, it will depend on the leader and what they need. Um, that said, we know there are certain things that all of our leaders need. Our leaders at Meta and in the world right now, like, we need to lead in high complexity, continual change, very dynamic environments where a lot of what we assumed to be true historically about leadership no longer holds.
Mhm.
And so, with that in mind, I've really designed quite a lot of different types of programs, everything from a quick 90-minute lab where we're going to work
Mhm.
One of my teammates actually just launched something a couple weeks ago about like how to lead under pressure. Feels very relevant in the world right now. So it could be a working lab for just 90 minutes. I also have very in-depth programs that I do with our leaders, seven-week journeys where we're coming together as a cohort, working really in depth at how they think of themselves, how they plan their sort of roadmaps and think about all that they're leading. So there's really quite a range. And to your point that a lot of your listeners are founders and VCs, I think it really starts with looking at how am I going to future fit my organization? So like, what are the skills, mindsets, capabilities that are going to be needed in the future for my org, and how do I build toward that so that you're not caught in sort of a catch-up mode with your organization or your leadership? That I think is a starting point. And once you identify those like skills, then you can develop all kinds of offerings around those.
I wonder, so like, what does a in-depth program look like? So like, and how do people, I guess, like, lead under pressure?
So the in-depth program, that was a 90-minute lab, and we did the leading under pressure, where there we're talking oftentimes about helping people understand healthy pressure when it tips to unhealthy pressure as leaders, how to ratchet up and ratchet down the pressure so that you're evoking all that, the beautifulness that comes with the kind of healthy pressure that enables people to innovate and be super creative, but can tip too much into like when people are stressed, then they aren't often bringing out their best ideas. So we're thinking about like, what are the environments, what are the tools that leaders have to cultivate that sweet spot where people feel safe, they've got the strategic clarity, and they've got the support that they need to be able to bring their best ideas forth. So in that example, that would have been a 90-minute lab with a toolkit. That was not something I designed. My teammate did for a lab series that I originally had created. But that would be an example of just tools that we're dripping into our system to help those leaders in the moment. When we notice, hey, in this current moment, pressure can be high. And as leaders, we need to be thinking about what's like a really helpful way to help our people not get too overwhelmed by pressure and to be able to have it be at the right levels.
For sure. What does the toolkit kind of look like to it sounds like a very similar to like CBT for some reason. And I guess for in terms of like healthy pressure, what is like the difference between like healthy and unhealthy pressure?
Well, this is it's a very personal question when you think about it. I mean, I could probably ask you, Grace, like what's that threshold when pressure feels healthy and generative? And what are your signals for yourself when it tips into something unhealthy?
For sure. I feel like a lot of times it's like if it's healthy, it's like when you're thinking about a solution instead of like thinking about the problem itself. And when it's like unhealthy, it's like you can't really do much about it. Like you have zero control over things. But this is just me improving right now. So like I'm not sure if it's the right answer. But it's like for me, it seems like, if you can't really do much, like you're like already out of control, or like this thing is like already not in your control arena. So like you just kind of let go instead of like being just super worried about what other people will do, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, I think that's a little bit the point. There isn't a right answer to what creates too much pressure. It's a personal answer. And if we're leading other people, we need to understand our people, understand kind of what that healthy pressure looks like. And I agree, it's sort of a felt difference between that like virtuous cycle upwards where you're like, wow, this is generative. And I'm kind of like, I've got a little bit of stress because I want to get this right. And that's creating novel ideas and pushing me to think differently, versus a type of pressure that just kind of pulls you down and tightens and narrows and constrains us. So it can be your body can be incredibly effective as a tool to give us data on where that, like what our energy is and what that's yielding.
For sure. What would you say is the biggest thing that like all the executives are concerned about?
I mean, we are all trying to figure out this world right now and how we are going to integrate AI. So I'm seeing that internally, externally, and how we recreate like the workplace of the future in a different world where AI is just integrated, native,
Everywhere.
and everywhere. It's such a novel, once in a generation type of challenge to figure out. I do think every leader I'm working with, every leader I talk to inside and outside of Meta
Mhm.
is thinking that through. And that feels like a good thing to think through.
I wonder, so I guess like when you were working with developing these like kind of programs, I know that you also authored a few books. Maybe we could talk about like how do you kind of like think about where to start first, and then how do you kind of develop a program that could fit into as many executive as possible, or I'm sure they also have their own like tailored experience, but maybe if you could give us a overall on like, how do you kind of like design these programs?
Sure. Yeah. Maybe I'll try and make it practical. One skill that I'm always trying to develop in myself that I see is like a high yield type of skill in the future, going back to that future fit
Mhm,
orientation, is systems thinking.
mhm,
So part of what's hard, I think, is as we enter a world with AI, is it sort of shakes up our understanding of how systems are going to work. And we're trying to all figure out, like, okay, what's the new system going to be? How is it going to operate? So systems thinking is about our ability to see not just individual things, but patterns between things, see the wholes, be able to entertain both and thinking. And as such, sort of developing increasingly sophisticated and mature ways of thinking that help then with discernment, decision making, etc. So that to me is a very durable, evergreen skill. We're going to need it in the future. It's not going away. In
mhm,
fact, the pressure to do it well is probably going to grow
mhm,
as the world evolves. So if I know I'm trying to work a skill like systems thinking, then I'm trying to craft a system of learning, which
mhm,
is going to develop these leaders in their systems thinking, right? And that might involve, so to start, I'm trying to understand, okay, well, where do I see the strengths of our leaders vis-a-vis systems thinking? Where does it get complex? And then I would be designing kind of ways to help them continually up level how they think about the systems that they're in. We might do tools and exercises like mapping of, like, can you map the systems that you're trying to influence, whether it's ideas for
mhm,
how to solve a problem, whether it's sort of the human systems that are needed to make an outcome happen in
mhm,
business. And we will use the means of basically doing different forms of systems thinking to continually sharpen the saw, so to speak, of that skill over time.
mhm,
And then we'll take that skill and sometimes apply it in different arenas,
mhm,
or we'll study other systems outside of Meta to in order to like give us inspiration, analogy. I mean, you and I talked initially about the power of like the concept of ikigai. So you often are
mhm,
dripping in other ways of thinking that can also enhance the core sort of methodology that you're working with leaders on. But that might give a little bit of a glimpse as to kind of how we think about, or how I certainly think about designing.
mhm,
You raise like a fundamental question in our field, which is the specialization versus scale. So whenever you're designing programs, if you're designing for a small audience, you usually have the privilege of really customizing it to their unique
mhm,
needs. And in fact, one
mhm,
of the highest compliments I got from a leader recently was them saying, I have never felt so well understood at work than by working
mhm,
with you. Right. And that is the task, right? Like you have to
mhm,
understand someone exceptionally well in order to help them understand their own potential and what might be their next sort of echelon of leadership. So when you're designing programs that are small scale, that's really the goal. Really in depth understanding of the needs, opportunities for that leader, and then really robust, meaningful development that's going to help them just step into a whole new level of leadership. When you're designing
mhm,
for thousands, you won't be able to bring that form of customization.
mhm,
However, like I do tend to design with like a container concept again in mind, where it's like I'm trying to create enough of the conditions and then invite people to bring their own challenges. And that's one of the ways you tend to get to higher levels of applicability and relevance, which I think is the goal for a lot of people in my field, where we really want to
mhm,
make sure everything we're doing isn't off on the side, out in some classroom, etc., but really
mhm.
integrated into the flow of work, or anything that you're learning immediately applicable and that you're trying out in back in your day to day.
For sure. I wanna maybe double click on the word that you mentioned as like a container.
Mhm.
So like I guess like for me, it sounds like it's kind of like a framework that you will propose, and then people will add their own scenario into it to
Mhm.
kind of like create their own um I guess like own results. So like it's kind of like the ikigai. I remember I was doing basically like I would write down my own ikigai. So like it's like there's like a three circle. I put in like, what I'm good at, like, what's in front of me, or like basically all that kind of stuff. So I guess like for you, what does a container kind of look like for the leaders? And since I feel like people, whoever are listening, probably they want to improve themselves, like what is like a one thing that they could take away to like kind of implement into their current day-to-day life?
Yeah. So there's two types of containers that I think we all need to grow. One is the like a content container. Your
Mhm,
Ikigai's example, framework is a classic version of it. I'm
mhm,
addicted to frameworks. I love them. I think they're beautiful, like shortcuts.
mhm,
No framework is complete, but all are helpful.
mhm,
And you can work with those that are tools that kind of create the container for your own
mhm,
thinking, reflection, etc.
mhm,
And then you can have a container that is a process. And so part of the container that I am always seeking to create is the conditions that are going to enable somebody to grow,
mhm,
right? And when you think about it, like you can't be in a space where you feel like you have to perform. So part of the container that we're always trying to create is that safety for people to get real about the challenges that they're navigating, be honest about
mhm,
struggles, own their wicked success, and create the right environment where people are willing to try out new behaviors,
mhm,
test different things, because we don't want people to come to a space to do what they've already been doing. We want them to come
mhm,
to a space to try new things, right? So that's
mhm,
a different form of container. To your question of like what I would love for people listening to this to take away, we are in such an interesting moment in terms of learning. So
mhm,
each of us, I would say like the most durable skill right now is your learning agility.
mhm,
I am finding an incredibly short shelf life
mhm,
of some of like the ways I used to design are now obsolete a week later when I'm integrating AI in new and
mhm,
interesting ways. And I can either be a little bit freaked out about that, which is natural in some regards,
mhm,
or I can be like lean into that and really think about like how do I leverage this new environment? What can I experiment? How do I build in just a few more minutes for me to test different things out? Because this is a newer domain that I'm, experimenting with. So I would just really say, like, do you have a system to learn? And if you don't have a system to learn, how do you know yourself well enough to build that out? So I'll give you a really practical example. For the longest time, when I find a book that I really like,
mhm,
I'm kind of old school. I still have, you can see examples of a
mhm,
lot behind me. I highlight them and I come back to all my highlights and I transcribe those notes into like my own sort of, if you ever remember the idea of like cliff notes, it's like my own
mhm,
version of what stood out in the book. By the time I
mhm,
have completed that process, I
mhm,
can probably quote most of what stood out to me in the book. So it's a process that actually helps me to retain that knowledge. Now, think about what's happening in today's day and age. I can go to AI and ask it to give me a detailed chapter by chapter summary, and it
mhm,
will be amazing. But I won't have spent as much time with the material. I won't have digested it. So I'm working right now to update my own systems to say, okay, well, and that might be really helpful. So I'm
mhm,
using it as a preview to say, does this feel meaty enough that now it's worth my full review? Or am I just going to take and glean those couple insights? But how am I going to make it sticky? How am I going to remember what that quick output that AI gave me is saying, because it's easy to see it, read it, be like interesting, and then move on and actually not retain a lot of it. So
mhm,
thinking about systems, I log like interesting tidbits on just a document so I can come back to the material that's interesting. Like, do you have ways to capture your learnings? Because it's such a ripe time. And very
mhm,
candidly, I think people who show learning agility are just going to be able to move up and through this period of pretty big disruption, and those who don't will, like, you start to just stagger, right? Like if every
Mhm.
day, Grace, you're doing a little bit more to learn
Mhm.
over time, that's the concept of like compound interest.
Mhm.
You're gonna be way ahead of me if I'm just plowing through my day, just trying to make things happen and not taking a moment to reflect on like, well, what am I learning right now? What would I do differently? Like if we don't get any of those learning loops going, we're setting ourselves up for a huge disadvantage, in particular in this moment.
What do you mean by learning loop? Or like, I guess like, oh, reflecting on the learnings. Would you, let's say, call it like every quarter you set up like, 5 days to like just kind of like go on a retreat and reflect on yourself? Or like, what does the format kind of look like? And then what are the questions beside like, what did I learn these days? I feel like you can always learn stuff, but also like the stuff could be like small things like, how do I use, I guess, certain AI tools, or like did I learn about like, the infrastructure, inference, or whatever. Like there's like the technical aspect of things, but also like the personal development side. I think a lot of it were towards like experience oriented things. So like I think like without managing people, like you can't learn about like management just by reflecting and stuff. So I guess like how do you balance the fact that like you you did a lot of stuff like, take big actions, and but also like kind of like actually can like actual, I guess, actualizing the
Totally. Yeah.
the learning. So I guess like
Yeah.
how do you formulate like what you have learned? Because a lot of this stuff are very vibe driven. So it's like you kind of have the a more of like an intuition on like what you should do next time than you articulate into like a down into a formula basically.
I think there's so much in your question that I'm intrigued to answer. So I'll try and keep it a little bit structured.
Mhm.
Um, to the first part of your question, we're like, do you go do like a quarterly retreat with yourself? Potentially. I believe deeply, though, in the work. James Clear has emphasized this a lot, which is consistency over intensity. And that's a
Mhm.
little bit what I was emphasizing with this idea of compound interest, too, of like if you're learning a little bit every day,
Mhm.
that's usually the most effective. And almost every leader at Meta who's
Yeah.
worked with me knows, like, I quote the study that came out of the UK that says like 15 minutes a day of reflection can increase your performance by about 23%.
Oh,
It's
wow.
like a really high ROI, right? And it makes sense because if you have an intuition about something you could do differently, a lot of people have that intuition and then move to the next meeting and do nothing different.
Mhm.
So what we're looking at is like the small mechanisms that are going to shift that insight or that intuition into action. Now, I do believe I take leaders through retreats, through step
Mhm.
backs. So I think it's really important to match the learning that you're seeking to the moment. So, like at Meta, we talk about like, are you in a defining moment where maybe you've just gotten promoted, you've just taken on a new remit, maybe you're new to joining our organization and trying to figure out
Mhm.
our culture. Like that would be a big moment where you might want to do a real holistic step back to see the systems that you're stepping into, to understand them, to think about how you're going to navigate into them, and more of the pull away to examine more in depth yourself in relation to these systems is important. Then you have like current moments, right? It's like right now, this is happening. Like we're trying to lead through continual change. What are the tools I'm going to need right now? And how can I tool up? And that lab we were talking about was like kind of right in that sweet spot of like, there's a need. Let's try and make sure everybody's tooled up to do this effectively. And then there's what we call micro moments, which are like
Mhm.
before I hit join on my Zoom meeting, am I just building the practice of being like, what does success look like in this meeting? And how do I want to show
Mhm.
up? And if I just take a millisecond, our brains, our brains can think a whole lot faster than we can speak. I sometimes try and bridge the difference, but
Mhm.
if you know that, then you can just find those small moments that really prompt that micro reflection. And I deeply believe in that. So we have tools like a leadership planner that invites every day people to think about like, what's your goal for today? What does showing up at your best look like? At the end of the day, like what are your key meetings at the beginning of the day? And then at the end, coming back and saying, what did you learn? What do you want to celebrate? Right? What are you
Mhm.
grateful for? Like really small prompts that can just take a little bit of that um, reflection and put it into action. And then
Mhm.
from that, and then so I sort of do a bubble up. It's like I have in the moment micro reflections in a minute. I think about it at the beginning and end of a day. We encourage leaders to do planning at the weekly level, like reflecting on the week. What was the main challenge? What did you learn from it? How could you apply that the next week? Like really small prompts, but actually pretty powerful ones in terms of making sure, to your point, that intuition doesn't just stay as an interesting idea, but does get translated into a slightly different experiment, a slightly different way of showing up, that next iteration. And that's what we mean by a learning loop, is like when you experience something and then you reflect on it, there's a possibility for an insight, a deeper understanding. And then what do you do with that insight if you take a different action or continue the action? Because maybe your initial behavior and reaction was a really powerful one, saying, good, I'm going to do more of that. Then you're in the learning loop where you've got the right rhythm of being able to see a situation, try something out, learn from it, repeat.
Mm. I'm just like furiously taking notes. I think like there's like three things that I feel like the audience could implement starting from today. One is like you mentioned, like before every Zoom meeting, you kind of like reflect on what would success look like. And then also like basically I think like also helpful like to just like write it down. So like I think like when I go into meetings, I typically write down like, what do I want to accomplish during the meeting and like basically what I can offer to the people. And basically I would write these like short notes. And maybe afterwards you can also reflect on like, you know, what do you want to celebrate? Or like what do you learn from this meeting? Or like what would you be grateful about?
Yeah.
And um I guess, like, the other question I have was, like, because of, like, people are very busy, and I think, like, it's, like, very shocking that when you said, like, you know, the stats says, like, 15 minutes a day when you reflect and, like, a 23% increase on performance. Um, I wonder, like, what does a 15 minutes kinda look like? So, like, how should we structure the reflection? Like, what are the aspect that we should be, like, kind of, like, reflecting on?
Yes. So I do believe that study is cumulative. So
Right.
this is where that compound interest will come back together. It's like if you do a few minutes of in the morning thinking about what's the day ahead, what does success look like for the day, and then you do that for each meeting, and then at the end of the day, you're probably doing over the course of the day a cumulative 15 minutes of
Mhm,
reflection. The other thing that I think is important is like what you may notice is some of that reflection is truly looking back. Like, how did that go? How did I show up? Something in that meeting kind of activated this energy in me. What is that? What do I
mhm,
want to do with that? Etc. And that's like the like retrospective reflection. But also you notice like some of the reflection we're talking about here is forward looking. How do I
mhm,
want to show up? What would success look like in this meeting? We're planning ahead and planning toward being our best selves, being at our best, and leading most effectively in the moment. And so I really try and encourage leaders to have a combination of the two, because that's actually it's really interesting. In my own experience, when I spent a few minutes reflecting back and a few minutes reflecting forward, it actually enables me to be very present in the moment because I've sort of thought about the past, I have an idea of the future, and it frees me up to give all of my attention to what we're focused on in the conversation. And real presence, deep listening, full undivided, it's like a cherished gift that we can give to each other that generates back to that generates really good ideas. If you give people just the space to hear themselves think in our very noisy world, they come up with incredible ideas. So like I
mhm,
also view even the reflection, planning forward, and presence as its own system that
mhm.
supports kind of our ability to be effective in the moment.
Um, I wonder how do you stay present? And you mentioned about like deep listening. I think most times, like because of like since like I'm sure like all the executives would have like 20 meetings a day, and then these like sometimes it's like I think I get the most anxiety attack by like having 3 15 minutes meeting an hour just because there's a lot
Very
of
intense.
context switching, and then like a lot of times it's like a lot of zoom out. Um, I guess, like, what's your suggestion on people to, like, have being present and like deep listening, just because I think it's very hard to not like being distracted or like not like I think a lot of times you're just like nodding on the Zoom call, but actually like have to depend on the note taker to tell you what to do next.
Yeah.
What would
Yeah.
you yeah.
It's a great question. I mean, I've even seen some thinking that in a sort of post-knowledge economy,
Mhm,
meaning like with AI really changing the markets in the future, we might end up being in a sort of an attention economy where attention and our
mhm,
own attention is one of the most valuable resources. Uh, I don't think I do anything revolutionary here, but it's maybe more the discipline. I will tell you this. I mean, I am notorious about putting things on focus mode. My husband will say I'm incredibly hard to reach at junctures because I've
mhm,
silenced everything. It's like we've got to help ourselves with technology in many ways. Not to that point, he needs to be able to reach me, but
mhm,
it's more setting up the environment and the conditions.
mhm,
To your point on context switching, if you actually think back to that reflection of like what does success
mhm,
look like, it's a context switching device designed to reduce the drag that we would otherwise feel if we just switched from one meeting into the other and didn't kind of like
mhm,
reset the context of that meeting. And that's really common. You're like close one Zoom, you open the next, you just kind of like you're 3 minutes in before you're like really grounded in why you're in
mhm,
that meeting. So some of those devices are explicitly designed to help in the context switching, to accelerate that, to focus it, etc. So I think those types of things can be really helpful. And then I do a lot of work. I believe a lot in Cal Newport's thinking on deep work.
mhm,
So I think it's a farce. It's a false assumption that we can be hyper present in like back to back 15-minute meetings, or that we're going to do um, really good, deep problem solving and work in really short time increments. So I really try and also spend time with our leaders on holding the pen of designing a work schedule that
mhm,
is going to elicit the best of them. And
mhm,
my assistant is probably the best on the 15 minutes because I'll be like back. I'm like, I got this. And he's like,
mhm,
no, you need a break. And I'm like, that's true. That's actually true. And
mhm.
you're helping me be a better version of myself. So it's like sometimes it's the discipline to know what we need and then implement it. But I do believe like I chunk types of meetings to help with the context switching. That helps me to be present in many different ways. And then I do structure my schedule to try and bring out the best. And I encourage all leaders I work with to really think about that because I think it's a wonderful like what do I want to call it? Like strategic hygiene. It's like I
Mhm.
often say, I'm like, hey, if you don't have a system to work here, our system's going to work you. Like it's so complex. There's so much going on. Like again, you really see my love for systems here. But it's like you need that system of how you're going to work to be optimized for you to do your best work and be very present. And sometimes we don't grab the agency that we have to design our work lives in ways that really enable that. So helping people to even reflect on those types of things can be a huge accelerant toward their own effectiveness.
I wonder, what would like since like you work with a lot of like really high performing people at Meta, like, um, what is people's like the most like guys not healthy, but like what is like the most productive kind of like schedule look like? I think because of like I think a lot of the founders are still in the hustle mode. They're not like executives yet, and I think there's a lot of like a lot of people have like chips on their shoulder, like they don't feel like they need to stop, and I feel like it's very hard for people to let go on like a certain meeting or because people always feel like oh they need to like I think the Silicon Valley hustle culture is still like very much there. Though people go to Burning Man, but like I guess like there's still like a lot of like people are working in like a 96 or 97
Mhm,
schedule.
mhm,
Um, how do people like keep the strategic hygiening, I guess.
mhm, mhm.
So, and then like as like the productive people or like people who are the executives, like how do you feel like they are making decisions on a day-to-day basis? Like because I think it's very difficult sometimes to jump out of the operator zone to like reflect on yourself, just because like I feel like if I take some time to like reflect, like there's no one is doing my work, and then if I'm just constantly reflecting, I won't be able to like get anything done. But on the other hand, if I just keep on doing things, like it's probably also getting nowhere because it's a lot of hard work, not smart work. So how do you think about that balance? And is there any particular structure or like strategic hygiene that you think people should apply beyond the, 15 minutes reflection? Maybe I'll call it like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, like 5 minutes reflecting.
Yeah. I I really appreciate the point on that there's sort of the hustle culture. We're rewarded for it. It feeds us. I'm a doer by nature, so there's something like in the like task completion initially of like, okay, I cranked through those meetings. I'm feeling successful. And like, but did I accomplish much? Or did I just rotate through a bunch of meetings? How
Mhm.
productive were they, etc. So we do have to do a lot of work with ourselves to kind of like catch what can be the shadow sides of our strengths, where it's like I'm of the type of person where it's like if I can get a task done, that is in
Mhm.
itself deeply rewarding. But now I need to make sure I'm not over optimizing for just getting tasks done. And
Mhm.
you're right, there's a culture that sort of rewards, celebrates busyness, which I don't think is the same as effectiveness. Number one thing I recommend, I led this exercise yesterday with some of our
Mhm.
leaders, is to do subtractive change. So do radical weeding. Most of us think about like, what more? How can I add more on? But in today's pace of change, I often find like a meeting series that I might have established a month ago, either in its structure, its duration, or its entire purpose, is out of date pretty quickly. And so I really encourage the practice of stripping, streamlining, pulling away. Like you're not back to like if the goal is to have some of that deep work time, which we do still see. And I would imagine most of your founders, if they think about their effectiveness, if you go back to that concept of flow where they're really in that sweet zone of maximum challenge, maximum input of like positive energy, and therefore really high output, it's happening in those deeper blocks. And those aren't just going to appear when you're really busy. You have to strip away, you have to discern, you have to delegate, you have to step out of things. So radical weeding as a practice, I think, is super important. And I want to like lovingly challenge, because this idea that like if I'm reflecting, I'm not doing my job. If you're a leader, your job is to be above, on the balcony of all that is happening, and to be able to see it. That requires reflection. It's some of the most strategic and critical work that you can do. And I think we live sometimes under the false assumption that the rolling up into the sleeves, which is also like I'm a roll up your sleeves type of leader. I love to get in the work, as Chris Cox often talks about, like touching the metal. I believe in getting close to the work that you're creating. I think that's really, really important. But I also know that those moments of reflection are absolutely critical. And one of my best indicators of this is some of my most novel, creative, powerful ideas haven't come when I'm trying to solve the problem. They've come when I've been out on a walk. They've come when I'm cooking dinner separately. They've actually come when I haven't been actively trying to solve what's in front of me, but my brain has had a little bit more space to think more expansively. And that
Mhm.
tends to be true for most of us. So then if it's like, if you know that, why not
Mhm.
create more space so that can happen organically, but also intentionally, right?
Mhm.
And create the conditions that are going to generate those ideas. You have to trust, because it doesn't have that same immediate generation. Sometimes you'll have one of those deep sessions and you go, oh, not a lot really came out of it. And then you'll have one that kind of creates an ROI that's worth 100 of those, right? And that creates, I think, that flywheel. So when founders have discovered that space, discovered the yield from it, then it becomes a more self-fulfilling. Then they're motivated to create more of that. You have to kind of have the courage, have the patience to switch gears and trust that it will come, and know that the ecosystem around you isn't going to necessarily reward in the same way. It is going to encourage the hustle, I think.
For sure. I think we talked a lot about productivity. Another genre of like question I had was like a lot of the business concept or like a lot of the business like arenas about relationships. And how do you make sure that like I think building like if the relationship is going smoothly, I don't think you need to worry about it. But obviously there's also a lot of conflict. So I guess there will be like a few situation that I feel like would result in stress or like in um situation that like people are uncomfortable with. One is like maybe there is um fighting over I guess like the outcome, like so basically like, who actually lead to the best result. Like for example, at a company, maybe there's like you and then there's like 5 other people who are working on the same problem and then who actually gets the credit. Maybe you think you're driving the discussion or you're driving the result, but actually other people took the credit. Like how do you kind of like like dissolve that kind of like thinking on yourself, or like how do you kind of like effectively communicate? Instead of just, I think like sometimes like if people just directly be like, hey, I think you did X and then I did Y, and then there's like I think that like the blunt communication or like the radical candor, it's like applying for only to a certain degree, right? So like I mean, I have a lot of respect for Kim Scott, who is like a
Mhm.
former guest on our show. And I think like the radical candor, it's like applying to a certain degree, but like not everybody can kind of like not every situation is handled that way. So like
Yeah.
it's like what are some tools that people could be using to maybe like resolve these kind of like result fighting or like some
Mhm.
sort of like conflict kind of situation?
Yeah, a couple thoughts on this. It's such a great one. I mean, companies, there often are natural competing interests between
Mhm,
functions, between different areas of the business. And one of the simplest, this is where I think you can pull on like Kim Scott's, like having radical candor about the competing interests. Like, so if you and I
mhm,
are working together, do we start by saying, like, what are some of the competing interests that we're going to have in our relationship that we're going to have
mhm,
to navigate? So many people don't actually talk about that, but then it's in the background, it's in the forefront, it's in the center of a lot of the conflict. So I do think trying to just name, and what that tends to do is it depersonalizes it. It
mhm,
recognizes that in our relationship, because of the system that we're in, there's going to be these natural tensions. And if we just call it, it gives us a chance to work really actively through
mhm,
that. We also spend time with our leaders thinking about like how to really build dynamic, strong relationships over time in a continually changing world.
mhm,
And what I often see, and I talked a lot about our leaders, is like most relationships break down because of a failure to connect deeply. This goes back to our presence. If you're in too many conversations with somebody who's mentally somewhere else, you don't feel that depth of connection and relationship. A failure to clear. So when we have idea conflict, or we have something sticky, or that creates residue in us, like do we let that build or do we tackle it? It's
mhm,
so critical to tackle, because if not, it can like drip deep into the organization and take years to kind of excavate from the system. And then do we a failure to contract? In today's world, I spend a lot of time with our leaders talking about dynamic contracting, which is like, how are
mhm,
we basically every time we come together honoring that the way in which we're going to work is probably needing to shift and change a little bit because the
mhm,
system's changed, the dynamics have changed enough that we just need to like perpetually contract. A lot of the conflict that you talk about usually would stem from one of those three things.
mhm,
It's history we haven't cleared, we fail to form a deep connection that allows us to be honest with each other, or we have different ideas about how we work together, and that's created the genesis. Between that, those three C's, and the competing interests, if you get all those at the table, you pay attention to all of those, that can be a really helpful way to break through. And that itself can be a type of reflection tool,
mhm,
right? So you can go through and do a relationship audit and be like, this relationship needs a little bit more contracting. We've had a lot of
mhm,
shifts, like, oh, I haven't like connected with that person. They mentioned
mhm,
something was happening with their daughter. I want to like check in on them and see how they're really doing. Right. Or And then the clearing, being like, yeah, that last meeting, it just got a little teensy bit sideways. I'm just going to make sure we come back and repair so that like teensy bit sideways doesn't turn into like a crevasse of conflict.
Mhm.
Those types of mechanisms, I think, are healthy and important. And the point being, when you do that perpetually, it doesn't tend to build into the big latent conflict that then erupts. And so I think that can be really helpful in sort of preventing that deep conflict.
Mm. I can you repeat the three C's?
Yes, most relationships in my mind sort of fail because of a failure to connect, a
Mhm.
failure to clear, like residue, and then a failure to contract continually.
How do we what is contract again?
So, like, if you and I were going to work together over time, we
Mhm.
would say, okay, Grace, let's talk through everything from what channels of communication we want to use. You introduced me today to StreamYard. It's new to me, right? So, it's
No,
like we're
yeah.
talking through what platforms are we going to work on, from the practical to the more profound? How are we going to make decisions together? Who has decision making rights on these topics,
Mhm.
right? It could be contracting, like, what's your role versus mine on this project?
Mhm.
That's oftentimes where people get a little bit sideways, where they may move fast and not be explicit about these things and realize they have different assumptions. So it's
Mhm.
literally just talking through, how are we going to work together, and leaning into the tougher aspects. Like, if we
Mhm.
think we're going to have competing interests around X, how are we going to navigate it? You can pre-mortem that. And then
Mhm.
what's beautiful is you get into the conversation, you're like, I think this is one of those moments where those like competing interests we talked about initially are there. Are you feeling that too? And it's like, what a beautiful way. That's where you can leverage, again, Kim Scott's thinking, to like use radical candor to kind of like call what's happening in order to tackle it more effectively.
I have a question on like, okay, so I think this is like a really clear framework. I like that. And like I wonder on separate topics, there is another part, it's like the competition in your mind. So like I think like competition, I would also using your framework on like healthy or unhealthy. There I think there's like some way to like make it healthy as like, you see the general landscape of your industry. And but on the I think the unhealthy part is like I think a lot of times we're competing ourselves, like using our weakness to someone else's strength. And in this category, like or like in terms of competition, how to make it like more effective than like, every day it's consuming you to a degree that's like, oh, okay, blah 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 just copied our feature, or like blah 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 just did X that's like seems like working well, but obviously their product's actually worse than ours. Like, how do we kind of like stand out from like, lack of marketing? So I guess like how do you think about um to a degree, like how do you think about like competition, and how do we have like a more effective mindset for ourselves too when it comes to leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I do think things like challenge,
Mhm.
competition can be incredibly helpful in sort of activating us to a
Mhm.
degree. And then you're spot on that it can sort of create a tipping point where it becomes a distraction,
Mhm.
destructive. And usually, in my experience, there's a couple conditions that sort of drive that. The one
Mhm.
is like the degree of focus. So if
Mhm.
you notice you're just hyper focused on just what
Mhm.
someone else is doing,
Mhm.
by definition, you're in chase mode,
Mhm.
right? Because you're appreciably worried, paranoid, whatever the right term is, but like worried about the competition. But if it becomes the myopic focus, then when you think about those moments where you have the possibility to think beyond, your solution set is usually often limited. It's a little bit more limited to how your competition is thinking about things, et cetera. Now you can do all kinds of incredible, interesting exercises to like,
Mhm.
take on your competitors' business and think about how you would, so you can lean into some of the thinking on that. But
Mhm.
in general, I just believe you have to be mindful and notice together as a team. Are we overly anchored on one type, one competitor, et cetera? And to what effect? Is it generative? It's like that same, to your point, healthy and unhealthy. Like, keep checking in on like, oh, this is fueling us. Or it's like, no, we're probably in a reactive space almost by definition because we're watching, then trying to figure out.
Mhm.
So I think paying attention to the sort of the energy with which you're approaching that,
Mhm.
and so much of I think today's innovation is also about expanding your point of view, seeing something in disparate industries and other spaces that can be generative, full of possibility and yield. And so, one just counter exercise, if you
Mhm.
find yourself overly focused on a particular competitor or just on competition, is to intentionally look to different domains, look to different industries. If you do so with curiosity, my grandmother taught me to be interesting, be interested.
Mhm.
And maybe another way to answer your question on presence is like, if I'm curious going into a conversation, I want to listen and it generates a different energy. But if you can scan this world with curiosity, you will find all kinds of really meaningful business insights that can help inform and sort of decouple an over attachment to a particular competitor.
Mm. I want to be mindful of the time. I think that's very helpful. I want to be mindful of the time. Maybe we do like one real question and a 30-second fire round.
Sounds good.
Okay, so one last question I had is like, how do you deal with a negative comment? So like whether it's like you're posting something on the internet, people gave you like a non-constructive feedback and like or they're just like hating on you for no reason. But on the other hand, as a receiving end, it always like kind of like make you doubt yourself a little bit.
Yeah.
um and or maybe like so and so, like a coworker or like people that you work with give you like a negative feedback. Like how do you kind of like take that, not like how do you like not letting yourself being defeated by some of these like comments?
Yeah. I want to delineate between a negative comment online from like an anonymous
Mhm,
stranger and like a
mhm,
colleague giving you critical feedback because
mhm,
I respond very differently to the two. I
mhm,
have a lot of admiration for the people in this world who are willing to create public profiles and sort of subject themselves to the way that you can have all those negative types of comments. I work on really simple devices, I think, in those moments to kind of catch and counter thinking. So
mhm,
the first thing I do is like if if it's in that anonymous stranger and probably
mhm,
not like really good credence to the comment, it's just meant
mhm,
to sting or something like that. Then I think it's just really important to depersonalize and be like, okay, I think that might be about them. There
mhm,
might be something happening in their world, and so like I'm gonna let the radius of that comment stay really closely focused on them. I'm not going to let it come into my world if it's really not a constructive comment and it's just
mhm,
negative. Now, when you get something from a colleague, I think this is an ongoing art form. People can have all kinds of incredible feedback. Sometimes their delivery is a little clunky. Sometimes it's not as helpful in its framing, etc. So I
mhm,
really try and delineate between the content of the message and the delivery. If I'm getting kind of impacted by the delivery, I'm also just asking myself, I'm like, is that my ego reacting? And if it is my ego reacting, then I'm like, okay, let me park my ego and I'm going to park the delivery of that comment and get to what like the content of that comment is. And if there's
mhm,
something good there to learn from, yeah, seize that. I think if you walk this world expecting that everyone around you can make you better, then you tend to seek it out. So I
mhm,
also just encourage people like have that stance. The worst situation is to not get feedback.
mhm,
And so I think it's just having a healthy orientation and then trying to size that comment as like, cool, that's helpful. I'm going to take that component, put it in my pocket, work with it, move forward.
mhm,
That's particularly useful. So I would just try and encourage that practice. And then I find the more you get feedback, the more it helps you to receive all kinds of feedback. So like seeking it out more often can be just a helpful way to build that as a learning loop, and then your orientation to it changes as well.
for sure. Um, okay, so let's do a 30-second fire round.
Okay.
What's your favorite book?
Mm. The Unbearable Lightness of Being. It's not a leadership book. It's a novel, but a very good one. Yeah.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Oh, I have such a hard time putting this on one person. Um, I'm gonna go with my mom.
Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Oh, I have so many people. Michelle Obama would be one of the top people on my list currently.
Uh,
Yeah.
Love that. Where can we find you outside of work?
Walking. I'm a big walker. It's my moving meditation. Most of my good ideas come when I'm walking. And I walk with a mission. You also see me walking fast. It's
I
my
love that. I
exercise.
love
Yeah.
that. I feel like, yeah, like walking like it's like a moving meditation. That's such a good way to frame it. I feel like I love these like kind of reflection zone when you're like moving. Well, Kate, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was such a master class for self-improvement. I feel like founders need to hear this.
Oh, thank you, Grace. It was a total pleasure to connect with you and to chat.
Awesome. Let me just quickly end stream.